Powers relative to appropriation measures. Contracting and guaranteeing foreign loans. Requisites for contracting and guaranteeing foreign loans. 1. With the concurrence of the Monetary Board, Section 20, Article 8. 2. Subject to limitations as may be provided by law, Section 2, Article 12. And 3. Information on foreign loans obtained or guaranteed shall be made available to the public, Section 2, Article 12. RA 4860. The role of Congress in foreign loans. The President does not need prior approval by the Congress because A. The Constitution places the power to check the President's power on the Monetary Board, and B. Congress may provide guidelines and have them enforced through the Monetary Board. Preparing and submitting the budget. Section 22, Article 7. The President shall submit to the Congress within 30 days from the opening of every regular session, as the basis of the regular appropriations bill, a budget of expenditures and sources of financing, including receipts from existing and proposed revenue measures. The budgeting plan. The budget is the plan indicating A. Expenditures of the government, B. Sources of financing, and C. Receipts from revenue-raising measures. The budget is the upper limit of the appropriation bill to be passed by Congress. Through the budget, therefore, the President reveals the priorities of the government. Program of expenditure. Even upon the enactment of the General Appropriations Act, the release of funds from the Treasury is still subject to a program of expenditure proposed by the Secretary of Budget to be approved by the President, and such approved program of expenditure is to be the basis for the release of funds. From the case of TESDA versus COA 2014, from Section 34, Chapter 5, Book 4, Book 6 of Admin Code. Fixing of tariff rates. Section 28, Article 6. The Congress may, by law, authorize the President to fix 1. Within specified limits, and 2. Subject to such limitations and restrictions as may be imposed on A. Tariff rates, B. Import and export quotas, C. Tonnage and wharfage dues, and D. Other duties or imposed within the framework of the national development program of the government. What is the rationale for delegation to the President? It is highly technical nature of international commerce and the need to constantly and with relative ease adapt the rates to prevailing commercial standards. Delegated powers. Principle of delegated powers of the President. The President, under martial law or under martial rule or in a revolutionary government, may exercise delegated legislative power. From Section 23, Subsection 2, Article 6. Congress may delegate legislative powers to the President in times of war or in national emergencies. Emergency powers. Under Section 23, Article 6. A. In times of war or other national emergency, the Congress may, by law, authorize the President for a limited period, subject to such restrictions as it may prescribe, to exercise powers necessary and proper to carry out a declared national policy. And B. Unless sooner withdrawn by resolution of the Congress, such powers shall cease upon the next adjournment thereof. How is it different from Commander-in-Chief Clause? Sa kalainan sa Emergency Powers and Commander-in-Chief Clause under Section 18, Article 7. A. When the President acts under the Commander-in-Chief Clause, he acts under a constitutional grant of military power. And B. When the President acts under the emergency power, he acts under a congressional delegation of lawmaking power. Congress the emergency powers. So, emergency powers actually is a delegated power of the Congress, while the provision under the Commander-in-Chief clause is presidential in nature, and it is a constitutional grant of military power. What is the meaning of power, necessary, and proper? Power to issue rules and regulations. This power is A, for a limited period, and B, subject to such restrictions as Congress may provide. When emergency powers cease. So when does emergency powers cease? 1. According to the text of the Constitution, the power ceases when A, upon being withdrawn by resolution of the Congress, or B, if Congress fails to adopt such resolution up the next voluntary adjournment of Congress. According to the cases, emergency powers cease when 1. The fact that Congress is able to meet in session uninterruptedly and adjourn its own will prove that the emergency no longer exists to justify the delegation. From the case of Araneta versus Dinglasan, 1949. 2. The specific power to continue enforce laws and appropriations which would lapse or otherwise become inoperative is a limitation to the general power to exercise such other powers as the executive may deem necessary to enable the government to fulfill its responsibilities and to maintain and enforce its authority. Rodriguez versus Hela, 1953. Inconsistencies between the Constitution and the cases. Barlongay. Barlongay. Emergency powers. Gusto ko kitang barlongay ito. I don't see anything barlongay. Inconsistencies between the Constitution and the cases. So, sa ilang kalainan. How are they different as to when emergency power cease? 1. The Constitution states that emergency power shall cease upon the next adjournment of Congress unless sooner withdrawn by resolution of Congress. 2. Cases tell us that the emergency power shall cease upon the resumption of session. So, how do we reconcile the two? It would not be enough for Congress to just resume session in order that the emergency power shall cease. It has to pass a resolution withdrawing such emergency powers, otherwise power shall cease. If no resolution withdrawing such emergency power is passed, such power shall cease upon the next adjournment of Congress. Okay, next. Executive power is residual powers. Pinakauna dyan eh. Marcos versus Manglapos, 1988. Residual powers are unstated powers possessed by the President which are 1. Not enumerated in the Constitution, 2. Implied with the grant of executive power, and 3. Not possessed by the legislative and judiciary. It includes powers unrelated to the execution of any provision of law. In Marcos versus Manglapos, the court held that the then President Corazon Aquino had the power to prevent the Marcoses from returning to the Philippines on account of the volatile national security situation. Note, the decision was pro hac vice. In MEWAP versus Romulo, the court upheld the reorganization of DOH through Executive Orders 102 and 1165, as it was within the President's residual power to restructure the executive departments, since he has the power of control over executive departments granted by the Constitution. The power to create ad hoc bodies is a residual power vested in the President in accordance with Faithful Execution Clause, from the case of Beraugo versus Philippine Truth Commission, 2010. Veto powers. Veto powers, as stated in Section 27, Article 6. Every bill passed by the Congress shall, before it becomes a law, be presented to the President. If he approves the same, he shall sign it, otherwise he shall veto it, and return the same with his objections to the House where it originated, which shall enter the objections at large in its journal and proceed to reconsider it. If after such reconsideration 2/3 of all the members of the House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent, together with objections, to the other House, by which it shall likewise be reconsidered, and if approved by 2/3 of all members of that House, it shall become a law. In all such cases, the votes of each Congress shall be determined by yeas or nays, and the names of the members voting for or against shall be entered in its journals. The President shall communicate his veto of any bill to the House where it originated within 30 days after the day of receipt thereof. Otherwise, it shall become a law as if he had signed it. Paragraph 2. The President shall have the power to veto any particular item or items in an appropriation, revenue, or tariff bill, but the veto shall not affect the item or items to which he does not object. What is the general rule in the veto powers? All bills must be approved by the President before they become a law, except when a. The veto of the President is overridden by 2/3 vote of all members of Congress. The President returns the bill with his veto message to the House where the bill originated, which shall then enter the objections at large in its journal and proceed to reconsider it. If, after such reconsideration, 2/3 of all members of such House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent, together with the objections, to the other House, by which it shall likewise be reconsidered, and if approved by 2/3 of all members of that House, it shall become a law. Or B. The bill lapsed into law because of the President's failure to act on the bill within 30 days. And C. The bill passed is the special law to elect the President and Vice President. Okay. Di ka makaveto, of course, because you're just acting. Limitations to the veto power. The President may only veto bills as a whole. Next power of the executive is executive privilege. What are the two kinds of executive privilege in Neri versus Senate Committee 2008? A. Presidential communications privilege by the President. So only the President can invoke. It refers to communications or communications are presumptively privileged. The President must be given freedom to explore alternatives in policy making. And B. Deliberative process privilege by executive officials. It refers to materials that comprise part of a process by which governmental decisions and policies are formulated. This includes diplomatic processes. From the case of Akbayan versus Aquino, 2008. What are the varieties of executive privilege? Senate versus Ermita. I've read this. Sa US lang niya siya. 1. It can be state secrets privilege, where it can be invoked by the US President, beginning with Washington, on the ground that the information is of such nature as its disclosure would subvert crucial military diplomatic objectives. B. Informer's privilege, the privilege of the government not to disclose the identity of the persons who furnish information of violations of law to officers charged with the enforcement of that law. And C. Generic privilege for internal deliberations has been said to attach to the intragovernmental documents reflecting advisory opinions, recommendations, and deliberations comprising part of a process by which governmental decisions and policies are formulated. From the case of Senate versus Ermita, 2004. Scope of executive privilege. This jurisdiction recognizes the common law holding that there is governmental privilege against public disclosure with respect to state secrets regarding military, diplomatic, and other national security matters. Closed-door cabinet meetings are also a recognized limitation on the right to information. Note: executive privilege is properly invoked in relation to specific categories of information and not to categories of persons. It attaches to information and not the person. Only 1. The President, and 2. The Executive Secretary, by order of the President, can invoke the privilege. From Senate versus Ermita. The following are the requisites for invoking presidential privilege. 1. There must be a formal claim of privilege. And 2. Specificity requirement. Under the formal claim privilege, for the privilege to apply, there must be a formal claim of privilege. Only the President or the Executive Secretary, by authority of the President, can invoke the privilege. And the second one is specificity requirement. A formal and proper claim of executive privilege requires a specific designation and description of the documents within its scope, as well as precise and certain reasons for preserving confidentiality. Without this specificity, it is impossible for a court to analyze the claim short of disclosure of the very thing sought to be protected. Once properly invoked, the presumption arises that it is privileged. If what is involved is the presumptive privilege of presidential communications when invoked by the President in a matter clearly within the domain of the executive, the said presumption dictates that the same be recognized and be given preference or priority in the absence of proof of a compelling or critical need for disclosure by one assailing such presumption. From Neri v. Senate. Requisites for validity of claim of privilege. 1. Quintessential and non-delegable presidential power. Power subject of the legislative inquiry must be expressly granted by the Constitution to the President. Example, Commander-in-Chief, appointing, pardoning, and diplomatic powers. 2. Operational proximity test. It must be authored, solicited, and received by a close advisor of the President or the President himself. The judicial test is that an advisor must be in operational proximity with the President, that is, officials who stand proximate to the President, not only by reason of their function, but also by reason of their positions in the executive's organizational structure. And 3. No adequate need to limit privilege. The privilege may be overcome by a showing of adequate need such that the information sought likely contains important evidence, and by the unavailability of the information elsewhere by any appropriate investigating authority. Neri v. Senate, Akbayan versus Aquino, for application of this principle. Diplomatic negotiations privilege. While the final text in the Japan-Philippine Economic Partnership Agreement may not be kept perpetually confidential, the offers exchanged by the parties during the negotiations continue to be privileged even after JPEPA is published. The Japanese representatives submitted their offers with the understanding that historic confidentiality would govern the same. Disclosing these offers could impair the ability of the Philippines to deal not only with Japan, but with other foreign governments in future negotiations. The objective of the privilege is to enhance the quality of agency decisions in assessing claims of privilege for diplomatic negotiations. The test is whether the privilege being claimed is indeed supported by public policy. This privilege may be overcome by sufficient showing of need. From the case Akbayan versus Aquino, Supra.